Mark and Olivia seemed to lead separate lives. He was a successful architect, married with children, and she was a 19-year-old nanny with dreams of a better life. But when their worlds collided in a forbidden affair, what began as secret stolen moments quickly spiraled into a deadly obsession. When Mark was found brutally murdered in his own kitchen, the question on everyone's mind was, could the sweet, innocent nanny truly be capable of such violence? The truth behind the grisly murder would shake a family to its core and leave a community grappling with the devastating consequences of love, betrayal, and rage. The quiet suburban neighborhood where the Rivers family lived seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. The homes were well kept, surrounded by lush greenery, and the streets were peaceful and safe. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, and the world felt untouched by chaos. In this seemingly idyllic setting, Mark and Laura Rivers had built their lives. Mark, a successful architect, worked long hours in the city, while his wife, Laura, a former lawyer, had opted to stay home and care for their two young children, Emma and Noah. To the outside world, they had it all: the house, the jobs, the family. Everything was in its place. But beneath the surface of this perfect family life, cracks were beginning to form. Mark had always been the hard-working, ambitious type. However, the longer he worked, the more distant he became from his wife. They had grown accustomed to their routines, but the emotional connection that once tied them together had started to fade. Laura, although content with her role as a stay-at-home mother, began to notice the distance between them. The days when Mark would come home excited to spend time with the family had become fewer and fewer. At first she tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just the stress of his job, but deep down, she felt the weight of his emotional absence. Laura didn't know that Mark's distraction had another cause: Olivia Foster. At just 19, Olivia was hired as the Rivers family's new nanny. She was bright, eager, and polite, a perfect fit for the family. Olivia quickly became an integral part of their household, assisting with the children, managing chores, and taking care of the house when Laura was busy. Her youthful energy and dedication to her job made her a beloved figure in the Rivers home. Emma and Noah adored her, and Laura was grateful for the help. Olivia, however, harbored deeper feelings than mere admiration for her employer. She found Mark captivating, with his quiet confidence and maturity. His presence was magnetic, and she couldn't help but notice the way he would occasionally glance at her with an intensity that seemed to linger just a little too long. At first, it was just innocent flirtation, but it quickly escalated into something more. Mark, too, noticed Olivia in a way he hadn't expected. She was young, attractive, and attentive in a way that Laura, caught up in the demands of motherhood, couldn't be anymore. Their interactions, always fleeting and casual in front of the children, began to feel charged with an unspoken tension. As the weeks passed, the subtle glances turned into more overt moments. Olivia, despite being aware of the boundaries she should respect, couldn't shake her growing attraction to Mark. She began to justify her feelings, telling herself that they shared a special bond, that he needed her, and that she understood him in ways no one else did. Mark, meanwhile, found himself increasingly drawn to Olivia. He was still committed to his family, but the attention Olivia gave him felt like an escape from his own personal dissatisfaction. The unspoken connection between them grew, their stolen moments more frequent and filled with longing. Mark found himself torn between his responsibilities as a husband and father, and the intoxicating allure of his secret connection with Olivia. It was a dangerous game he didn't plan on playing, but neither could resist the temptation. The family dynamic, once so harmonious, began to change as both Mark and Olivia became trapped in a web of desire and deceit. And all the while, Laura remained unaware of the brewing storm in her own home. The perfect facade of their family life was about to shatter, and none of them had any idea of how devastating the consequences would be. As the days passed, the connection between Mark and Olivia deepened in secrecy. What had started as innocent conversations over coffee or quick exchanges when the children were napping slowly blossomed into a full-blown affair. Neither of them expected things to spiral so quickly, but the chemistry was undeniable, and soon it was impossible to resist. Olivia had never experienced anything like it before. Her heart raced whenever Mark was near, and his attention made her feel alive in ways that nothing else could. Mark, too, found himself caught in the whirlwind of emotions. He had never expected to develop feelings for someone so young, especially someone who worked in his own home. But Olivia's youthfulness, her energy, and the way she seemed to look at him with admiration, stirred something within him. The guilt of his actions was overshadowed by the excitement and thrill of their secret encounters. They met whenever they could, slipping away from the eyes of the family to share stolen moments of intimacy. The house, once a place of family and warmth, became a stage for their illicit meetings. They were careful, taking precautions to avoid suspicion from Laura or the children. Mark would often find excuses to stay late at work, and Olivia would linger in the house after the children had gone to bed, ensuring they had enough time together to feed the fire that had started burning between them. What began as a harmless flirtation soon escalated. Mark found himself coming home late more often, under the guise of work commitments. But the truth was he had become addicted to the time he spent with Olivia. Olivia, once the innocent and dutiful nanny, began to see herself as more than just a caretaker. She imagined herself in a different life, one where she was not bound by the role of a nanny, but the partner of a successful man like Mark. She told herself that she understood him in ways no one else did, that their connection was real and that eventually, things would change between him and Laura. But the reality of their situation began to weigh heavily on both of them. Olivia's guilt started to seep in, especially when she saw Mark with his family. The warmth between Mark and Laura, the way the children looked up to their father, was a painful reminder of the life Olivia could never have. She knew she was betraying Laura, but the allure of Mark's attention was too strong to resist. Meanwhile, Mark was growing restless. While he was still committed to his family, the emotional and physical connection with Olivia began to consume him. There were times when he questioned his own integrity and wondered how he had let things go so far. But when Olivia would look at him with those longing eyes, he pushed aside his doubts. Their secret moments became more frequent, more desperate. Olivia was falling deeper into the fantasy of a life with Mark. And with each passing day, she became more possessive. She started noticing small details, when Mark would return from business trips or when Laura would mention plans for the family. A sense of jealousy began to take root in Olivia's heart, and with it came a growing sense of frustration. She was no longer content with being the other woman, the hidden figure in the background. She wanted more. For Mark, things were more complicated. He didn't want to hurt his family, but he was torn between the duty he felt toward his wife and children and the desire to escape into a world with Olivia, a world where he didn't have to worry about the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood. He began to make excuses, telling himself that it was just a phase, that he could keep it under control, that no one would ever find out. But deep down, he knew things were spiraling out of his control. The affair, once something that felt exciting and new, was becoming a dangerous game. The lies and deceit that had started out small began to pile up, and soon neither Mark nor Olivia could keep track of what they had told each other, or what they had told themselves. The danger was no longer just in the secrecy of their relationship, but in the emotional toll it was taking on both of them. They were getting tangled in a web of their own making, and neither of them knew how to break free. Olivia's hope for a future with Mark was growing more unrealistic. while Mark's internal struggle intensified. All the while, Laura remained blissfully unaware. The house was still full of the normal sounds of family life. Laughter, children's voices, the hum of daily chores. Yet beneath it all, a storm was quietly brewing, one that neither Mark nor Olivia could escape from. The walls of their secret affair were closing in, and no one, not even them, could foresee just how destructive it would become. As the weeks passed, the facade of normalcy within the Rivers household began to erode. The tension between Mark and Olivia, though hidden beneath the surface, became palpable. What once felt like a secret bond, an exciting escape from their daily lives, had started to feel like a trap. The emotional consequences of their affair began to unravel both of them in ways they hadn't proudly anticipated. Olivia's feelings for Mark had deepened, but not in the way she had expected. The more time they spent together, the more possessive she became. She began to feel entitled to his attention, convinced that their relationship was special, even though it was still built on lies. She would watch Mark with Laura and their children, feeling an ache in her chest. The family that had once seemed so perfect now felt like an insurmountable wall between her and the life she imagined with Mark. In those moments, Olivia's jealousy began to fester. She would catch herself imagining what life would be like if Mark were hers, if he had left his wife for her. It became harder for her to simply accept being the other woman, the one who only got a piece of him when it was convenient. She wanted more. But Mark, though still caught up in the excitement of their affair, began to distance himself. The guilt he had been suppressing started to creep in, affecting his interactions with Olivia. He would find himself thinking more about Laura, his children, and the family he had built. The once carefree meetings with Olivia, those stolen moments of passion, had begun to feel like a burden. The guilt weighed heavily on him, especially when he saw how invested Olivia was becoming. He knew he was leading her on, but he wasn't ready to end the affair. Their communications grew strained as Mark became increasingly evasive. He would cancel plans at the last minute, citing work commitments or family obligations. He started avoiding private moments with Olivia, using excuses to keep things distant. Olivia, hurt by his lack of attention, couldn't understand what was happening. She started feeling rejected, confused. The man she had once felt so close to now seemed so far away, as though he were slipping through her fingers. It was then that her feelings of betrayal turned into something darker, something far more dangerous. She began to believe that Mark was pulling away not just because of guilt, but because of something or someone else. The thought of losing him to anyone else, even if that person was his wife, became an obsession. Mark's actions didn't help ease her fears. One evening, as she was cleaning the house after the children had gone to bed, she overheard a conversation Mark had on the phone with his business partner. The conversation was casual, but there was something in his tone that struck her. He was talking about a weekend getaway he and Laura had planned, a trip that would mean he wouldn't be able to see Olivia. The news hit her like a ton of bricks. She had known, deep down, that Mark was still tied to his family, but hearing him casually discuss the trip with Laura made her feel invisible, insignificant. Olivia's mind raced, replaying the conversation over and over. Was this his way of ending things with her? Had she been just another fling? The jealousy and hurt she felt soon morphed into anger. She had invested so much of herself in this affair, convinced that it was something more than just a brief affair. Olivia felt that Mark had been leading her on, making her believe that they had a future together, but now she saw the truth. Mark had no intention of leaving his wife. He was using her for excitement, for escape, but ultimately, he wasn't going to choose her. The thought of being discarded, of being left behind, became unbearable for Olivia. Her emotional turmoil reached a boiling point. She was no longer content to play the role of the secret lover. She began to lash out in small, subtle ways, attempting to get Mark's attention or force a confrontation. Each time Mark pulled away, each time he avoided her, the simmering anger grew. It wasn't just the affair anymore. It was about control. Olivia wanted him to see how deeply he had hurt her, how his rejection stung. She believed that if she pushed him far enough, he would be forced to make a choice. But as Mark continued to distance himself, the tension between them became unbearable. One evening, Olivia finally confronted Mark. It wasn't the calm conversation she had hoped for. Instead, it was a heated argument where accusations were thrown and emotions were raw. Mark, tired of the secrecy, tried to end things with her. He told her he couldn't continue the affair, that it was time for both of them to move on. But those words, meant to bring closure, only ignited Olivia's darkest feelings. In that moment, she couldn't fathom the idea of losing him, of being thrown away like the others before her. Her love for him twisted into something unrecognizable, something far more dangerous. The jealousy and anger clouded her judgment, and the consequences of their actions were now on the edge of something tragic. The night Mark's life was tragically cut short began like any other evening. Olivia, however, could no longer contain the swirling storm of emotions that had built up over the past few weeks. The jealousy, betrayal, and anger had taken root deep within her. When Mark arrived home late that night, his usual indifference toward her was more than she could bear. The confrontation had been brewing for days, and it reached a breaking point in the quiet of the empty house. Olivia had spent the day replaying their past conversations in her mind, torturing herself with the memories of how he had made her feel special, how he had once promised her they'd have a future together. But all that had changed. Mark was now more distant than ever, avoiding her at every opportunity. The coldness between them felt suffocating, and Olivia's heart, once filled with love and longing, now churned with resentment. When Mark finally stepped into the house, Olivia was already waiting for him in the kitchen. Her eyes were red, swollen from crying, but her determination was clear. She was ready to make him see how badly he had hurt her. He noticed the tension immediately, but he didn't think much of it. Mark was used to Olivia's moods, though something in her demeanor struck him as different this time. There was a sharpness in her eyes, a kind of intensity he hadn't seen before. "Mark, we need to talk," Olivia said, her voice unsteady but demanding. Mark had grown weary of these talks. He knew what was coming, the same arguments, the same pleas for him to choose her over his family. He wanted to avoid it, to keep things simple. But Olivia wasn't going to let him off so easily. She needed answers, something more than the excuses and half-hearted reassurances he had given her in the past. "I'm done, Olivia," he said, his voice cold. "It's over. I can't keep doing this." The words hit Olivia like a physical blow. She had known deep down that this moment would come, but hearing it spoken aloud shattered her. She had never truly believed he would walk away from her like this, not after everything they'd shared. His rejection was final, and it struck a nerve deep within her. Her mind, already clouded with emotional turmoil, began to spiral into a state of rage. She couldn't let go, not yet. Not after everything she had invested in this relationship. Without warning, Olivia's trembling hands reached for the sharp kitchen knife resting on the counter. She hadn't planned this, hadn't even thought about it. But in that moment it felt like the only way to make Mark understand the pain he had caused her. Mark, noticing the movement, raised his hands in a defensive gesture. But it was too late. In an instant, Olivia's anger took over and she lunged at him. The knife sliced through the air with terrifying precision, and Mark barely had time to react before the blade sank deep into his side. A scream tore from Olivia's throat as she stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark staggered backward, shock and pain written across his face. He looked down at the blood staining his shirt, then back at Olivia, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The two of them stood in that kitchen, one lost in anger, the other in disbelief, both trapped in a moment neither could undo. Olivia, wide-eyed and trembling, dropped the knife as reality began to crash in on her. She hadn't meant for it to happen like this. She never wanted to kill him. But Mark, his face paling by the second, collapsed to the floor. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body twitching as he struggled to stay conscious. The sight of him, the man she had loved and hated all at once, lying there bleeding, was too much to process. Olivia didn't know what to do next. She was paralyzed with fear, horror, and regret. As Mark's body grew still, Olivia's world unraveled around her. The love she had felt for him, the deep connection she had once believed was real, was now shattered beyond repair. In her desperation to hold on to something that had never been truly hers, she had destroyed it all. The aftermath was worse than any of the chaos she had imagined in her worst nightmares. Mark was dead, and nothing she could do would bring him back. In the silence that followed, Olivia stood motionless, a mixture of shock and disbelief hanging heavily in the air. The house, once filled with warmth and life, felt empty and cold. The consequences of her actions had just begun to unfold. The perfect life she had imagined with Mark was gone forever. Now she would have to face the truth of what she had done. Mark's body was discovered by Laura the following morning when she returned from her Dr. OES appointment. The gruesome scene sent a shockwave through the family. The betrayal and violence that had unfolded in that house would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Olivia's fate was sealed in that moment. The questions of why and how would soon be answered, but the true horror of the situation lay in the irreversible damage Olivia had done in her desperate attempt to hold on to a love that was never hers to begin with. The morning after the murder was one of the most horrific moments in Laura's life. When she arrived home, she had no idea that her world was about to shatter. Her doctor's appointment had run late, but there was nothing unusual about the late hour. The children had already been tucked into bed and she expected the house to be peaceful, just like any other night. But when she stepped through the door, the silence hit her like a wave. Something wasn't right. She called out for Mark, but there was no answer. The house seemed unnervingly still. Laura's intuition, honed over years of marriage, sensed that something was terribly wrong. As she walked through the hallway toward the kitchen, a cold chill swept over her. That's when she saw him. Mark's lifeless body sprawled on the kitchen floor, blood staining the tiles beneath him. Her heart stopped. For a moment she couldn't process what she was seeing. Mark, her husband, the man she had spent nearly a decade with, lay dead before her eyes. Panic gripped her as she dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to check for a pulse, but it was no use. Mark was gone. The weight of the moment crashed down on her as she struggled to breathe, her world imploding in an instant. She couldn't understand how this had happened, who could have done this, or why. But one thing was clear. Mark was murdered, and someone in her family had to be responsible. The house was eerily quiet as Laura stood up, her mind racing with questions. Her first instinct was to call the police, but her feet felt like lead. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on the knife that had been used in the attack. It was on the counter, its handle stained with blood. Her gaze then shifted to Olivia, who was standing in the corner of the room, staring at her with wide, haunted eyes. The young woman who had been part of their family, the one who had spent so much time with Mark and the children, was now the last person standing in that room with her. Olivia's expression was one of shock, but there was something more in her eyes. Something darker. As Laura tried to process the scene before her, Olivia whispered the words that would change everything. "I didn't mean to. It just happened." The words were barely a whisper, but they were enough. The truth hit Laura like a sledgehammer. It wasn't an accident. Olivia had killed Mark. A surge of disbelief washed over Laura. She had never suspected that Olivia, the young woman she had trusted to care for her children, could be capable of such violence. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but they didn't make sense. How had things gone so wrong? Why had Olivia, who had been so kind, so devoted to the children, chosen to end Mark's life in such a brutal, senseless way? The police arrived quickly, taking control of the scene and questioning Laura. She was in a daze, unable to comprehend how her life had fallen apart in a single night. Olivia was arrested, her face pale and eyes vacant, and she was led away without resistance. The investigators questioned her thoroughly, and the details of her confession began to emerge. She spoke of the affair with Mark, of her deep feelings for him and the growing sense of betrayal when she realized he was pulling away. Olivia admitted to being consumed by jealousy and anger, believing that Mark no longer cared for her in the way he once had. In a moment of uncontrollable emotion, she had lashed out, stabbing him in a fit of rage. The truth was chilling, but it was also clear. Olivia had killed Mark not in self-defense or in a moment of fear, but out of a twisted sense of betrayal and desperation. The news spread quickly through the community, leaving everyone stunned. The family that had seemed so perfect, so untouchable, had been shattered by a horrifying act of violence. Olivia, once the trusted nanny, became the center of a media frenzy. The investigation revealed the full extent of her obsession with Mark, and soon the public's opinion of her shifted from sympathy to condemnation. The affair, hidden for so long, had been exposed for all to see. The picture-perfect family, once the epitome of suburban success, was now marked by tragedy and scandal. As the trial unfolded, Olivia's story became a tale of obsession, love, and betrayal gone horribly wrong. She was sentenced to life in prison, and though the legal system had delivered its verdict, the emotional scars left on Laura, Emma, and Noah would never heal. The children, still young, struggled to understand what had happened to their father. Laura, now alone, had to find a way to rebuild her life after the unimaginable betrayal that had destroyed everything she had once known. The Rivers family's story, once filled with promise and hope, became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly love, deceit, and unchecked emotions could spiral into a tragedy that no one saw coming. For Laura, the pain of losing her husband and her trust in Olivia would never fade. The once perfect family was gone, replaced by an unhealable wound that would scar them all forever.